Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, y lo dieron todo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children, and they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
SETI's results for 2018 proves our effectiveness as a development partner, placing people at the center of our work and leveraging partnerships and cooperation to transform policy imperatives into action. With an eye on the rapidly changing global context, SETI is innovating to constructively address the emerging challenges and opportunities for the region. As part of our competitiveness program, SETI is designing precise tools to assess assets and capabilities in the productive sector to determine paths towards higher value goods and services. As our flagship program for partnerships, the Americas Competitiveness Exchange on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the ACE, will continue to leverage good practices and the power of networks to increase trade and investment in the region.
For us, the role of the OAS is very important, connecting countries, connecting governments and private sector, and letting us know what other countries are doing it and how we can replicate that in our countries to enhance development.
For me, who has come here to look at how can we develop our own ecosystem, our own innovation hubs, our own accelerators, I think seeing this, touching, feeling, seeing the transformation, seeing how quickly we made it happen, is a testament to what is possible. So I believe all of us leave here stronger than ever.
The Working Group of Experts on Subnational Competitiveness, the GTEX, is our gateway program to promote local economic competitiveness policies alongside municipal and state-level governments, together with the private sector and academia.
Este tipo de reuniones te sirven para darte cuenta de todo lo que se está viviendo en América Latina sobre los temas de competitividad. Y hoy justamente en este sector estamos viendo sobre todo los temas de innovación tecnológica, pues que si hablamos de competitividad tenemos que hablar de tecnología. Y me está ayudando mucho para ver el panorama de ver lo que están haciendo otras ciudades y lo que podemos llegar a aplicar también nosotros en México.
The hub on the transfer and commercialization of technology is connecting and strengthening national innovation ecosystems in the region. Each edition of the hub trains budding technology entrepreneurs from the region's public and private sectors to take promising products and services from idea to market.
¿Por qué es importante que estemos juntos en esto? Porque la región tiene que estar unida y me parece que hay mucho conocimiento en la región que todavía no está explotado comercialmente como podría ser, y esta es la mejor manera de hacerlo.
Tenemos la proyección de cada año generar y compartir nuevas experiencias entre aquellos que contribuyen a la innovación. Queremos cambiar el cómo lo hemos estado haciendo en Latinoamérica. Queremos generar la unión de los países, queremos colaborar.
Our virtual platform on technology foresight, Prospecta Americas, will support OAS member states in identifying and mapping future trends and technological development of critical importance for the Americas.
Este esfuerzo, el cual viene siendo apoyado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, nos permitirá tener una gran información para poder mapear estas iniciativas de innovación y poder que ellas contribuyan al crecimiento económico, a la competitividad y al bienestar de nuestras naciones.
Como bien sabemos, nos encontramos ya en la cuarta revolución industrial, la que está cambiando rápidamente la forma en que se hace negocios, se produce, se consume y se genera bienestar y entretenimiento en el mundo. Es la mayor amenaza, tal vez la mejor oportunidad que tenemos en nuestras naciones.
The Inter-American Teacher Education Network, the I-10, is working to improve the quality of teachers with an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resources Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand of member states for platforms and applications that enable data-driven policies. In the Central American region, for example, we are expanding the scope of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical. This tool captures and disseminates real-time climate and water data, promoting resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. In a region where 8 out of 10 consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet, y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA, y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, y lo dieron todo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children, and they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Center's program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno y lo dieron todo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo por ahorita.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children, and they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Nestor. It is an honor to be in this special meeting to honor and promote the rights and the socio-cultural assets of the Aboriginal peoples of the Americas. In 2018, our organization celebrated the Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples, the OAS, on the week of August 9th, in line with the commemoration of the UN of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. The theme for this year is to leave no one behind, Indigenous peoples, and a call for a new social contract in the Americas that speaks to the historical marginalization of these peoples. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the deep social and economic differences and divides that have existed historically. There needs to be an end to this. We need to be able to see the end. We need to address a more pressing issue now, which is the distribution of vaccines in the indigenous communities, particularly for those who live in isolated regions. This is an effort that must be done by all in each of our countries, and that the hemispheric community needs to take action on in order to ensure that there is equitable distribution of vaccines. Secondly, as the title for this week says, we need to call for a new social contract that includes indigenous peoples as active participants in order to correct mistakes of the past when they were excluded from our social and economic agreements and political tenets. Last week, Carissa Etienne from PAHO stated that indigenous communities are the most vulnerable to COVID-19. According to the specialist, it is difficult to get reliable data on the impact of COVID-19 in these communities because most countries in the region do not collect or enter information regarding the effect of this pandemic into the systems. Based on the limited information reported to PAHO, 617,000 people in indigenous communities have been infected with COVID-19 in the Americas, with tens of thousands who have died, and these numbers are way too high. We need to redouble efforts in order to stop this pandemic, and in order to do that, we need to work together to find regional solutions for this regional problem. COVID-19 is not the only pandemic we're suffering from today. We're all also witnessing the terrible pandemic of violence against indigenous women in the hemisphere. This is a critical moment of the pandemic. This commemoration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples and the 4th Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples must also be a celebration. But a celebration of what? Well, allow me to recommend that this is also a celebration of the resilience of indigenous communities who have been able to withstand all the heritage and traditions of these communities. This is where we must also ensure that these rituals and traditions are also part of the new contract for the good of humanity and the planet. We cannot think of the Americas without indigenous peoples. The history, the knowledge, the traditions are all part of who we are, and we should be proud of recognizing that. The next step is to ensure that this acknowledgement can be embedded in a new social contract that our region will have to redesign in the post-pandemic world. The time to act is now. It is time to act on this new social contract in order to ensure that economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights are all recognized just as they were in the American Declaration. This American Declaration recognizes the development of indigenous communities in the Americas and their ability to also make sure that they are in charge of how development takes place. We call on member countries to implement the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and for those who have yet to do it, to ratify or also adopt this declaration to address the intolerance and also in order to stop to repay that debt that we have with these communities. I wish you all a successful and productive week full of strength and wisdom. We must step up our efforts here at the Permanent Council in order to build these social contracts that are absolutely vital. A hemispheric social contract is absolutely key on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. And I have to say that that is a most important statement that we've heard from the Secretary General, not least his final plea to us at the Permanent Council to step up our act in the delivery of the social contract, which now cries out for implementation. Esteemed colleagues, we will now hear remarks from our other distinguished guests. The first of whom is Mr. Luis Bachala, Minister of the Secretariat for the Management and Development of Peoples and Nationalities of Ecuador. Minister Bachala, I welcome you and I invite you to address us, sir. You have the floor.
Your Excellency, Luis Almagro, Secretary General of the OAS. Your Excellency, Ambassador Washington, President of the Permanent Council. Fouilat Salam, Governor General of Belize. Distinguished representatives of the different countries in the Americas, in representation of the people of Ecuador, out of the millions of indigenous peoples who live in Ecuador, it is a pleasure to address you all. In 1520, the brother of Montezuma Emperor died because of smallpox. Exactly 500 years went by before the history of epidemics once again started to rear its head. This was something that affected indigenous peoples and the world overall. As I was looking through a David Kuth book titled Born to Die, Disease and Conquest of the New World of 1492-1650, I was shocked by the findings. In the book, it states that approximately 95% of indigenous peoples in the Americas didn't die because of war or conflict, or rather because of outbreaks. If that is the case, then what lessons can we draw from epidemics in indigenous communities, and how did this help us address the pandemic of COVID-19 in a better way this century? In indigenous communities in Ecuador, the lessons learned were notable. The way that people organized and cooperated and immediately communicated the ancestral medicines, these were the community strategies that curbed the spread of the pandemic. In terms of the knowledge that we have in our ancestral systems, COVID is seen as a disease that is what we call hot. In order to counter this, cold plants were necessary in order to address it. Sambo, eucalyptus, ginger, paitena, garlic, they all played a key role and were able to provide a cure to several indigenous and non-indigenous communities in Ecuador. Therefore, it is time to praise and raise the profile of what governments do, but also what indigenous communities do, what is happening internationally and nationally, and understand how important it is to see these medicine alternatives in the face of a pandemic. In 2020, however, we saw different challenges from what was experienced in the 16th century. For example, there was the blow to the economy, connectivity, and education in indigenous families. These are the new challenges we're facing. How prepared were indigenous communities to face these new challenges? This is why it's important to talk about this problem and talk about economic, technology, and education resilience of indigenous communities in the Americas, and particularly in Ecuador during this pandemic. We were able to withstand COVID, but we will not be able to withstand the lack of technology and connectivity. Telework was an alternative, but not a reality for indigenous communities. 82% of the income for households depends on in-person work and daily work. However, our farmers continue to work their lands. And this is work that, despite the pandemic, led to all households around Ecuador and around the world being able to put food on the table. If it weren't for these people who still went out into the fields, people would not have had enough to eat. This is why there needs to be a priority given to all plants around the world to help these communities. Additionally, according to the National Institute of Statistics and Census in Ecuador, 84% of all households have no access to the internet in rural communities. That affects indigenous communities. This has led to the dropout rates that will have medium-term consequences, will broaden the economic, social, and education gap, because we still cannot talk about teleeducation. This is why in this special meeting of the Permanent Council of the OAS, in which we commemorate the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples to be celebrated on every August 9th of every year, I call on organizations, I call on private companies, on governments, and on ambassadors to all come together to be the solution in the face of this new challenge and these new challenges that affect most of all indigenous communities. This pandemic may not have had the same fatal impact it did 500 years ago in indigenous communities. However, the economic, technology, and education impacts are going to cause significant damage. In order to keep the history of our peoples from repeating itself, the national government of Ecuador, headed by President Lasso, the new Peoples and Nationalities entity was created, and this is how we are addressing the most pressing needs, like the lack of connectivity and the vaccine plan in indigenous communities. We're also strengthening and increasing the use of ancestral practices, including what is being used to address COVID-19. But this is not all. We also need our friends to step in. I would like to also urge all sister nations to join us on this walk. As we hear from the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Together, towards development and unity of the peoples and nationalities of Ecuador. Thank you very much.
Minister Pachala. I will now request that the Secretariat shows a video address by Mr. Ciro Galvez Herrera, the Minister of Culture of Peru. Secretariat, please proceed to play the video. Thank you very much.
Minister of Culture, ladies and gentlemen, I bring you my greetings for the International Day of Indigenous Peoples. We in Peru are particularly pleased to be able to be with you. We also thank the President and Mr. Pedro Castillo for appointing me as the Minister of Culture. Brothers and sisters, today all Peruvians are getting to know each other and to support our current government because we, the indigenous people, are now in control. With that in mind, from today moving forward, the state will be governing for all of us, all of the original peoples. And it is for this reason that we must all support our country, Peru, to be able to make progress. Fellow ministers, I bring you the cordial greetings for the Republic of Peru, for remembering you for the indigenous peoples here on this International Day of Indigenous Peoples. For the first time in 200 years of the Peruvian Republic, there is an indigenous person as a minister in this government, and many are rejoicing about this. The some 12 million native Peruvians in Peru rejoice. And that is why our brothers and sisters, indigenous peoples, need to move the cart forward so that all Peruvians can be happy and seek the well-being of all Peruvians working together in a strong multicultural state. Brothers and sisters, I bring you my greetings and wish you the best. Interpreter reading from the Spanish language subtitles.
Impressive presentation. Our next speaker is Mr. Asensio Palacio, the Vice Minister for Indigenous Affairs of Panama. Mr. Palacio could not be with us today, but was also kind enough to record his presentation. I ask the Secretariat to play the recording, please.
It is a great honor to participate in this forum on behalf of President Laurentino Cortizo Cohen and the 7 indigenous peoples in my country, Panama. I would like to thank and honor in this forum all of the indigenous leaders who fought across the continent and around the globe for the rights of indigenous peoples. Today, we have an opportunity to address a core theme of Indigenous peoples and the call for a new social contract in the Americas, leaving no one behind. This topic will allow us to evaluate and make visible the benefits of the Indigenous population in terms of economic, educational, political, social, cultural, and human rights development. Panama has substantive legislation that recognizes the fundamental rights of Indigenous peoples, starting from the Constitution itself, the political constitution of the Republic, the laws that create the Indigenous areas, the collective lands. In addition, our country is a signatory of several conventions, treaties, agreements, and international regulatory instruments that protect the rights of Indigenous peoples. Despite this, Indigenous peoples are the most vulnerable of all of our people and where multidimensional poverty is concentrating. The strengthening of the Vice Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, the improvement in health and education with cultural relevance will lead, of course, to the promotion of sustainable agriculture and promoting rural tourism, particularly in Indigenous territories, are all of our efforts. We are also promoting the plan to eradicate border issues, as well as this government supports the massive vaccination of all Native peoples against COVID-19. In view of the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals and within the framework of the new social contract, the Indigenous peoples propose the following. 1. That their own worldwide view be heard and respected, allowing them to manage their own path to development. That their culture, way of life, political and social organization be respected. And that a special budget be allocated to developing projects in the original territories. That, furthermore, comprehensive programs and projects also be developed to benefit the Indigenous population, women, youth, and children. And that the participation of Indigenous peoples in the design, implementation, and evaluation of projects is encouraged to measure the sustainable development of these programs in each of the territories. Consequently, it is urgent to reconnect with Mother Earth. We cannot continue to destroy our environment, to contaminate our rivers. We cannot continue to destroy our identity. We are required to act in a more timely fashion so that together we can build a better world, one that is more participatory, more inclusive, leaving no one behind. Thank you very much again for the invitation to this forum, and thank you to all of my Indigenous brothers and sisters across the globe.
I thank the Permanent Mission of Panama for making this recording possible. I'd also like to ask the delegation of Panama to please convey our appreciation to Vice Minister Palacio. Our next speaker is Ana Milanio. Now, I apologize if I mispronounce her name. My intention is good. She's a special advisor for Indigenous Affairs of the Indigenous Affairs Coordination Unit of the Chilean Ministry of Social Development and Family. Mrs. Milanio, welcome. You have the floor.
Señora Milanao, tiene que encender su cámara.
Miss Milanao, please turn on your camera and your microphone. Thank you. Very well. Mai Kopuche. I bring cordial greetings to all in my native language of Mapudungun. Secretary General, Madam Secretary General of Belize, fellow panelists, ministers all. It has just been a few days since we have celebrated International Indigenous Peoples Days, and in that regard I would like to thank Carba Rubilar, the Minister of Government, for the effort that have been undertaken under the current administration of Sebastián Piñera to be able to engage in dialogue with all of the indigenous peoples present in Chile. As an advisor to the government and the first Mapuche indigenous person to be able to hold this post, it has been important to bring forth a representation of the indigenous peoples, our presence in our constituent assembly with the election of 17 indigenous peoples to this group. The ongoing participation of indigenous peoples is the primary means for generating the confidence needed to ensure that the wealth and the diversity of their vision are included. For our administration, it is therefore very important to express our satisfaction with the recent constitutional reform that modifies the Constitution of Chile in an unprecedented fashion. The project was proposed in December of last year and was enacted on the just a few short months ago. This effort to ensure this participation in the Constituent Assembly of our indigenous peoples was hotly debated, but it also included the participation of the Aymara, Rika Anatai, Quechua, Goya, Diaguita, Kawaskar, Yagan, Tambo, and other Mapuche peoples in the heart of Congress where this bill was negotiated. The point behind this constitutional reform was to ensure robust indigenous participation in the Constitutional Assembly, creating 17 reserved spots for the indigenous people within the 155 positions available. In addition, the parity nature of the indigenous peoples was respected in terms of the division between men and women, as well as the participation of all indigenous peoples recognized in the Republic of Chile. The law again was published 8 months ago, and it is obvious the contribution that these indigenous peoples are making to the Constituent Assembly process. We have seen this brought to fruition not just with the election of the first woman of indigenous extraction to lead the Constituent Assembly itself, but also appreciation of language, recognition of ancestral authorities, and many other topics. Cognizant of the political and cultural process and transformation that we are experiencing, I am convinced that the participation of the indigenous peoples in each nation will not only contribute to the strengthening of each country, but also to the social, political, and economic development of countries that encourage such participation. I send you greetings in 5 of our indigenous languages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Melanau. Now I give the floor to Mr. Gustavo Pineda, the head of the unit for the promotion of the rights of indigenous people and Afro-descendants in the Ministry of Culture of El Salvador. Mr. Pineda, welcome, sir. You have the floor.
Excelentísimo
Secretary General of the OAS, Luisa Almagro, Chair of the Permanent Council, Sir Ronald Sanders, Fräulein Salam of Belize. From the interpreter, sound at origin is very much wanting. we will endeavor to do our best. The history of indigenous peoples in El Salvador is undoubtedly connected to the dynamics of the other peoples of Mesoamerica, but it has certain unique features that make it very much dramatic. Even though the indigenous peoples were once vassals of the Spanish crown and therefore had some legal provisions and protections, the reality was far from pleasant. That is why our history records 43 uprisings during and after the process of colonization, which were invariably met with cruel repressions. One of the main threads in the path of the indigenous peoples is the post-colonial plans and the lands allotted in terms of community property and the so-called ejidos in a perpetual and inalienable manner. As a result, these people were made invisible and were the victims of violent dispossession. In 1832, the dynamic provoked the uprising of Anastasio Aquino, who came to dominate a portion of the national territory. The turning point to the extension of the ejido lands in 1880 came through special laws, which led to further dispossession and an obligation to work on coffee farms in the so-called laws against vagrancy. The consequences of this dispossession was the indigenous uprising of 1932, which led to further extermination of a large number of indigenous peoples, some 10,000, depending on different sources. To date, these events have not yet been fully clarified and reparations have yet to be made. Consequently, while El Salvador has taken contradictory actions, in 1940, El Salvador ratified the International Convention relative to the Inter-American Indian Congresses and the Inter-American Indian Institute. And in 1958, El Salvador ratified the ILO Convention 107. The situation did not begin to change until 2007, and then subsequently 2014, when the Legislative Assembly reformed the Constitution, recognizing indigenous peoples in Article 63, Second Clause. In 2016, the OAS General Assembly approved the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and at the national level, the culture law was approved. As you can see, it's been a long road to bring the Salvadorian state and bringing it to recognize change in favor of indigenous peoples. In the last 10 years, local regulations have also been developed in the eastern and western parts of the country. Just a few days ago in San Antonio del Monte, in Sonsonate, a new rule was approved where this is where 38 years ago there was an unfortunate massacre of over 70 indigenous peoples. The Cuscatlán plan of the current government includes the development of the national policy for indigenous peoples. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Salvadorian state has placed special emphasis on providing food supplies to indigenous communities, as well as the elderly, covering a large part of the territories identified as being in greatest need. Furthermore, on occasion of International Day of Indigenous Peoples, the best tribute will be the reaffirmation of the Salvadorian state to its commitment to indigenous peoples and the continuity of its trajectory in that direction in a progressive manner as part of an inclusive and integrated development. In short, the Salvadorian state has initiated a path in favor of indigenous peoples that will not cease. We are, in fact, a fabric of several dissimilar and sometimes contradictory identities, but for that very reason, we are capable of generating new things, necessary changes, where we cannot leave anyone behind, because it would mean leaving us all behind if we apply the principle of the Inlaquech, that is to say, you are my other self. Thank you very much. From the interpreters, apologies for the choppy rendition. It was due to choppy origin, sound and origin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pineda. Now, colleagues, we've heard many voices of authority and relevance today, and their message has been powerful, strong, and consistent. And what is part of that consistency is that they have called us all to action. So I hope that we are all taking account of the very strong messages that we are being given today, starting with the Secretary General, who reminded us that we must step up to fulfill our duties. Now, I have no doubt that our next speaker will deliver as compelling a statement as those who have preceded him. I invite now Mr. Alvaro Pop, an indigenous leader and former secretary of the Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples of Guatemala, to address us. Mr. Pop, you have the floor.
Sa incholejichu kere, hualsa sa inchol na kuantina rin ut hualsa sa inchol na teokochi atinake rikin. Nin kosla na klikakomon blika ralchot teokech rabin kilka rujokos kebal. A los pueblos indígenas.
To the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the International Day that calls us to become aware of our realities, the challenges of interculturality, the challenges of a new model of life capable of supporting and harmoniously serving all of humanity. In times of uncertainty in the face of the current and future impact of the pandemic we are experiencing and the economic crisis it entails, in the face of the crisis of climate change that demands substantive changes in daily life, in the business approach, and the tasks of state institutions at a global level. Faced with this, the principles of life, the approach to coexistence, and the ancestral traditions of indigenous peoples become an option that can help the new social coexistence. I respectfully greet you, Chair of the Permanent Council, the Governor of Belize, our sister for Salam, the Secretary General of the OAS, and each of your excellencies, representatives of our states and societies in this conclave that represents the region of the Americas. I congratulate and appreciate this valuable space to be able to hear and engage with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. I take advantage of this opportunity to recognize the states that have made substantive strides to care for indigenous peoples who are suffering the impact of the pandemic. The conviction and our commitment to democracy is of the utmost importance, as democracy is in danger of moving towards a more electoral mercantilism. It has become increasingly expensive, and there is a risk of political debt and corruption. Our populations are fed up with the instability of democracy and its inability to solve everyday problems. One of these problems is migration. Many countries are facing the challenge of solving the fact that our greatest export product are human beings who are sending remittances back to their families in amounts that become a substantive portion of income in our countries. Solving this challenge involves addressing more intensely the issues of land, decent employment, rural areas, economic informality, and increasing social protections. In several countries in the region, the latest social protest movements demanding structural change, including a new social and political pact based on constitutional reforms or changes, are being led by the positions of indigenous peoples. Despite the improved mechanisms of information and communication and those technologies that are more intense, faster, and more popular, communication and articulation between governments and society are increasingly distant and deficient. The results of the Latino Barometer since 2013 were already beginning to show that the honeymoon of democracy was running out in the first decade of the 21st century. On December 10, 2020, Dr. Alicia Bárcena, Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, called for the construction of a new social covenant, a new social compact that would allow us to move forward, a new social contract. The United Nations has also established as the primary message of the International Day of World Indigenous Peoples 2021 to leave no one behind. The Indigenous peoples and the call for a social contract go hand in hand, as is also noted by the Organization of American States in the concept note of this great event. The experience over the last 2 decades of the UN is illustrious and illustrative. We can see that the 20th century more and more peoples have demanded recognition by their countries and then marched to the UN Forum to have an international voice. Today, many indigenous peoples have taken up as their own demands for identity, an agenda for bilingual education, the revision of state policies, and the elimination of discrimination and racism that have existed since the colonial era, as well as a recognition of specific rights that have been demanded in Latin America. These are all expressed in the declarations and structures collected since the 1960s. What does this mean for the growing movement around these rights and ensuring their full respect? It means concretely that the social and political contracts agreed upon 200 years ago, and in some cases our constitutions are less than 50 years old, are out of date. They are completely insufficient. They have been overtaken by events. They gave what they could give, but they can give no more. And above all, the demands for more quality of citizenship established by the evolution of democracy requires better equipped individuals to ensure social and political participation that allows for better societies and better indigenous people who are free, as well as prior informed consultation as expressed in the American Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. The new social and political compact must find a new development paradigm and have 2 concrete objectives. First, a universal welfare state. As said by ECLAC, equality, productivity, and democracy are strategic. They are not substitute goods. All 3 are necessary. Second, the universalization of rights, obviously including the right to be different, to have a different opinion, and to make our cultures flourish in this new framework. What the peace accords could not achieve in the region, it seems that the pandemic is returning to our national debates. But why do we refer to all of this in the context of indigenous peoples? Because we are a part of every Latin American country, with its problems, with their hopes, with their light and shadow. It is indispensable to overcome the comfort of segregating us into working groups or even so-called specific indigenous windows for indigenous peoples without taking into account the voice of indigenous peoples and these in the national, fiscal, legal, and political context. It has to do with indigenous peoples because states have sought to universalize democracy and the rule of law, but they have failed to fully include indigenous peoples. An example of this is the challenge of financing and the coverage of intercultural bilingual education in almost all countries, despite the constitutional recognition of indigenous languages, the ratification of ILO Convention 169, and the Inter-American and UN declarations on indigenous peoples. In this regard, Latin America is an example for the rest of the world. but yet in this context, referring to indigenous peoples continues to be a regional challenge. This is why I congratulate everyone on the approval of the Inter-American Plan of Action for the Fulfillment of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples signed by the presidents and heads of state and government at the Ibero-American Summit 2018 in Antigua, Guatemala. The creation of the Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean is a regional institutional moment of progress that must be fully utilized in communication with Indigenous peoples, and the commitment of our states must be fully manifested financially, especially in the face of the economic recovery as a result of the pandemic. It must fully serve the slogan of this International Day of International Peoples of leaving no one behind. The Popol Vuh of the Mayas says the same, and we must work for a new social contract and political contract. Creativity in the face of emerging challenges, and tolerance for the voices that demand to be heard. From this melter pot that we have can come a new, more evolved institutional experience, and one with a participatory democracy. Hence, the challenge of a new social and political pact for each countries in Latin America that will benefit us all. I send you again greetings in my native language. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pop, for that very impassioned statement. Because of its passion, of course, Mr. Pop exceeded our 5-minute limitation. But I am going to ask you, please, the remaining speakers, to please adhere as best you can to our 5-minute limit. We have resource constraints, as you know, and we must try to keep within the time that we've set. Now I ask the Secretariat to play a video address by Mr. Gabriel Mendez Lopez, a leader from Mexico representing the indigenous people.
Brothers and sisters, today I greet you with much affection and from my hometown in the municipality of Chiapas. I am Gabriel Mendez, an indigenous Tzetzel of the Mayan people of the state of Chiapas. Today, I would like to share with you the process of reforms in these reform proposals that are currently underway in Mexico. And this has been happening for over 2 years now. Through the Institute of Indigenous Peoples of Mexico, there was a proposal for a constitutional amendment. But from this amendment, the aim was to see how everything in the country is linked to indigenous peoples. This is what led to regional consultations in Mexico, where in each forum, each consultation, each meeting and assembly, there was a collection of thoughts on how important this specific concept is in the constitutional amendment. This starts with the first article and goes into the second article, which are very important points, and where the constitutional rights of our peoples are enshrined in the Constitution. Constitutional rights and some of these other articles haven't considered so far our forms of government, or only recognizes a specific type of conventional government, which is what the rest of the government system follows. However, out of these forums with consultation, there were a number of opinions from authorities that were gathered. Following that, after these different indigenous forums were held, and these consultations were held as well, and led by the National Indigenous Peoples Institute in tandem with the Congress as well as the Secretary of the Interior. This work continued. The National Institute then sought to systematize this very important work. And the very president of Mexico was to present this bill and bring it to Congress. But this was after all of these different proposals were systematized, and then that led to a proposal for constitutional amendments on the rights of Black Mexicans and indigenous peoples. And this led to 15 key articles in the Constitution, from the first article, the second, 21, 26, 27, 35, 50, 73, 89, 94, 99, 102, 116. These are all key articles that call for considering the rights of indigenous peoples. And what we see here is that today in Mexico, it is easier for a civil society organization to be recognized by government agencies, but not recognized by the community leaders and local governments. But right now there is an acknowledgement of the rights of indigenous peoples, and this is at the very heart of why this amendment is so important. Recognition of indigenous peoples as peoples who have rights. Also see an acknowledgement of its forms of government. And that is what allows for self-determination. This allows for legal diversity in Mexico from the different indigenous groups and communities. And this is the amendment that allows for the support provided to these different regional consultations that help to collect signatures in order to see what the endorsement is from indigenous communities. And so as these signatures are collected, this would be the first document presented by the president of the country to be backed by all indigenous communities and peoples and local authorities to support this important change. The first is a recognition of indigenous peoples as subject to public law. In Article 100 of the Constitution sets forth the recognition of indigenous political regimes as the new estate. And this is a key amendment for indigenous peoples. After all of the institutional work is carried out, the president will be charged with bringing this before the Congress to allow the members of Congress to consider this constitutional amendment and ultimately adopt it. I believe that this is a key task for members of Congress as well as for local congressmen and women. We have representatives of the 28 indigenous districts in Mexico. 21 indigenous districts have put together proposals in order to be represented in National Congress. This is why we should invite our brothers and sisters in Congress who represent indigenous peoples and ask them to support this important amendment for indigenous peoples. That is what I wanted to share. This very important process taking place in Mexico after the San Andres agreements and the signature. This is the proposal that could potentially help go beyond just recognizing the rights that we have seen and that have been proposed in the San Andres agreements. At that time, it was simply put away and forgotten about. This proposal that was not delivered on, but the will is what we're trying to tap into so that the government can pay back its debt towards indigenous peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the representative of Mexico, and I thank the permanent mission of Mexico for making that presentation available. Now, Mr. Wayne Garnons Williams is the chair of the International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization and a senior lawyer and principal director of the Indigenous Sovereign Trade Consultancy in Canada. The title of his organization alone suggests that Mr. Garnon Williams' statement will be of great help in educating and informing this meeting. We look forward to hearing your presentation, sir. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With your permission, I have a short 5-minute PowerPoint presentation. May I present it?
If that short 5-point presentation, sir, is your entire presentation?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, Secretary General, Your Excellency, ambassadors, ministers, delegates, I am Indigenous, Plains Cree, Treaty 6, Moosomin First Nation. I address you as chairman of the International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization. ITIO, as it's been known, has been in existence for about 7 years. We organize global Indigenous trade symposiums, and we facilitate productive discussion, objective research, effective education with respect to international trade, and recommend policies,
Excuse me, Mr. Wine.
regulations. Yes?
We cannot see your presentation. Perfect. No,
I
yes.
apologize.
Thank you.
There we go. I apologize for that, ladies and gentlemen. I will go back here. Yes, we have been involved in, we provide effective discussions, objective research, education on making recommendations for policy, legislative proposals, and regulatory proposals to further global flow and exchange of Indigenous goods and services. Some of the stuff we've done so far is we've made submissions for the Canada-United Kingdom Trade Agreement, the Inclusive Trade Action Group, ITAG, Mercosur, Foreign Trade Promotion Protection Agreement, the Indigenous Peoples Economic Cooperation Agreement, as well as the United States Indigenous Trade Consultation on the development of a U.S. international Indigenous trade policy. Canada's Inclusive Trade Agenda, ITIO has actively participated and helped develop that. And part of that is the Indigenous Trade Chapter, which is in 3 things. 1, to recognize the important role of Indigenous peoples in both historically and now. And 2, to facilitate cooperative activities for international Indigenous trade. And 3, to develop a committee to oversee the implementation of that chapter. And I'm happy to say that the Indigenous Trade Chapter is successfully included in the Mercosur. As well, there's emerging opportunities in Indigenous trade. Let's look at some figures here. For example, the Maori economy of New Zealand have a combined $70 billion in assets composed of land ownership, international trade-ready forestry, fishing, land production. In Canada, over 50,000 Aboriginal businesses and over 31 billion added to Canada's gross domestic product. In the United States, well limited with information, looking at just 3 states out of the 50, Oklahoma, Washington, and Minnesota, $17 billion in cumulative economic impact, with combined gross annual revenue of $6 billion and well over 25,000 U.S. jobs in various tribal industries. Now, Indigenous peoples from around the world see that investing is so important in helping financial capital get off the ground. And the concept of today of the circular economy, that's an Indigenous concept. And as you know, most linear European-based businesses have followed the ancient process of take, make, and waste. By contrast, Indigenous circular economies employ reusing, sharing, repairing, refurbishing, remanufacturing, recycling, creating a closed-loop system, minimizing the use of resource inputs, eliminating the creation of waste, pollution, and carbon emissions. Indigenous peoples around the world, out of necessity, have developed and used an Indigenous circular economy since time immemorial. In Canada, Indigenous communities are embracing the renewable energy sector by applying their traditional knowledge to the circular economy. First Nations, Inuit, Métis people are involved in and own more than 150 large-scale clean energy projects. For example, some of that 95 hydro, 38 projects wind, 12 projects biomass, 11 projects solar, 56 projects energy conversion. This is leading the way. And don't forget the investors, because we need the investors to help with the capital. The ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and is an investment indicator. Those 3 factors are used when measuring sustainability and ethical impact of an investment in the business or a company. And most socially responsible investors check companies out with the ESG criteria to screen their investments. And Indigenous people meet those criteria, surpass those criteria, especially when it comes to environmental responsibility. the future of trade with respect to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It's a universal call to action to address, among other things, sustainable economic development, poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. And indigenous trade is closely tied to the UN SDGs. Indigenous trading nations, by their very unique experience, are best suited to help nation states meet those international UN SDG goals. So my final thoughts in closing, IDEO will be hosting the 7th International Indigenous Trade Mission and Conference at the College of Law, University of Oklahoma, United States of America, June 2022. Join us in Oklahoma and learn how to lead your Indigenous people into economic prosperity while upholding Indigenous economic rights as founded in ILO 169, the American Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the United Nations Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I thank you and I yield my time.
Chairman, you're on mute. Thank you very much, Mr. Garland Williams. Your presentation was as fascinating as I expected it to be, and very educational. Thank you very much indeed. Now I would like to offer the floor to Mrs. Patricia Velasquez, the Organization of American States' Goodwill Ambassador for the Rights of Indigenous People. You have the floor, Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Sanders of Antigua and Barbuda. Señoras y señores, representantes permanentes.
Permanent representatives to the OAS, Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro. Nice to see you. Assistant Secretary General Nestor Mendez. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. In 2018, I was honored to be appointed by Luis Almagro, Secretary General of the OAS, as Goodwill Ambassador for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the Americas. That has been an important acknowledgement, not only for me and for my people's Goju, but also for the Goju Foundation. According to ECLAC, in Latin America, there are 826 indigenous peoples, with a population that amounts to close to 45 million people. As you know, our diversity expands across our cultures, our languages, our ancestral knowledge, and our identities. However, one of the common denominators is the special relationship we have with Mother Nature and with our land. The lack of understanding of this special relationship by a considerable number of countries and the private sector has led to social conflicts, to indigenous activists being slain and forced displacement of indigenous peoples in the Americas and in the world. Additionally, we're usually excluded from consultations on projects that affect our land for issues like tourism and for natural resource exploration. The Inter-American Court on Human Rights has handed down a number of sentences recognizing the violation of human rights, including the right to self-determination and territory that we have possessed from before the so-called colonization. The social contract has not been fair for groups that have been historically discriminated against, such as indigenous peoples. This discrimination and historical inequality has been compounded by COVID-19. This inequality cannot and should not be ignored. However, the pandemic, despite the tragedy, offers an opportunity to rethink our society as a whole. Against this backdrop, governments need to be truly willing to really formulate new social contracts with the goal of creating inclusive and diverse societies that do not leave indigenous peoples behind. Indeed, that leave no one behind. That is why meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, is now more important than ever. In the 2030 Agenda, there are 6 direct references to indigenous peoples. For example, when we look at SDG 2 on agricultural production for smallholder farmers and SDG 4 on equal access to education for indigenous children, we also see that in 10 on reducing inequality in order to keep the gap from growing among different people, and that includes dimensions of gender as well. The agenda also calls for indigenous peoples to be active participants in implementation of SDGs, particularly in the monitoring and review of this progress nationally, to ensure that the progress actually also affects the issues that have an impact on our communities. The 2030 Agenda is also directly related to the American Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and its action plan. This is also why it is of the utmost importance for governments to meet their inter-American commitments. Indigenous peoples have inter-American and national instruments to combat discrimination and social inequality. However, there needs to be true political will so that we no longer are left behind. Building and redesigning a new social contract is more than urgent. We need to take into account also the impact from development activities in the past. Finally, this new social contract needs to be based on a true and full participation of all segments of society that fosters equal opportunity and respects rights, the dignity, and the freedom of indigenous peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Velasquez, for that very important presentation. We appreciate it. Now, to conclude this portion of today's agenda, the Permanent Council is pleased to welcome what is becoming a regular face at our meetings, the President of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Antonia Urahola, who joins us in her capacity as Rapporteur of the Rights of Indigenous People. Commissioner Urahola, you have the floor.
Hello, Ambassador. Nice to see you. Thank you very much. Muy bien. Bueno, buenos días a todas y todos.
Very well. Good morning, everyone. Allow me to first acknowledge Ambassador Sir Ronald Sanders, who is chairing our Permanent Council meeting today. Her Excellency, Governor General of Belize, Fouad Salam, as well as our representatives from Ecuador, from Peru, Luis Almagro, Secretary General of the OAS, and Esther Mendez, Assistant Secretary General. A special greeting as well to all officials and leaders and everyone who is with us today, ambassadors and permanent representatives to the OAS, as well as to everyone else in attendance. As President of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, I would like to express my gratitude for this opportunity to share some words as we commemorate the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. First and foremost, as others have already said, in relation to the pandemic, the ICHR reiterates how vulnerable indigenous communities are in the face of COVID-19 and calls on governments to take specific steps that are consistent with cultures and respect for territories in accordance with Resolution 1/2020. To also ensure universal access to vaccines for everyone in their jurisdictions without any discrimination and equitably. The Commission reiterates that governments need to ensure that there are no limitations that can specifically affect communities who are at heightened vulnerability or who have historically been marginalized, which are, among others, peoples from indigenous communities. In this regard, governments need to carry out public outreach campaigns with indigenous communities and distribute vaccines in these jurisdictions in coordination with and with the participation of these communities through representative officials, through leaderships, and also respecting the customs and also ensuring that there is respect for self-determination and territories. As it has been said by different bodies of the Inter-American system, governments have specific commitments when it comes to indigenous communities and ensuring that everyone is taken care of within national boundaries, including in autonomous communities. This is fully in line with the respect and acknowledgement of different cultural visions, perception of well-being and development, and also to the right of these communities to exist as indigenous communities following their own traditions. However, these communities haven't always been understood and recognized and protected. Historically, indigenous peoples and tribal peoples have been subject to marginalization and discrimination. Historical exclusion practices for assimilation, territorial disposition, and looting have led to violations of rights in indigenous communities and tribal communities in the Americas and the rest of the population. During its tenure, the Commission has been able to see through its different mechanisms that over the last few decades, there have been significant strides made in recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples when it comes to jurisprudence and legal systems, both nationally and internationally, in public policy, and in looking at discrimination practices, in recognizing languages, and other areas of progress. However, we have seen that there are also major violations of the fundamental rights of indigenous peoples. In recent years, the Commission has been concerned by the assaults, harassment, and murder of members of the indigenous communities and human rights activists who are doing work to defend their land and their territory as indigenous communities. In this context, the Commission warns that indigenous communities are the source of hope for all of us as humanity. Ironically, the peoples who have been resilient in their ancestral lands, despite the constant threats, are the best stewards of nature and forests, thanks to their multi-thousand-year-old knowledge. With respect to the different jurisdictions where indigenous peoples live in our hemisphere, the Commission has noted that these groups have developed productive practices and knowledge linked to the natural environment and used for livelihood. The FAO, in its report on indigenous and tribal peoples and forest stewardship and opportunity for climate action in Latin America and the Caribbean, recognizes that indigenous and tribal peoples and forests in ancestral lands play a key role for global and regional climate action and to combat poverty, hunger, and malnutrition, and highlights that forests and lands for these communities play a key role in stabilizing the climate locally, regionally, and globally because of the carbon and water they store. This becomes even more urgent after reading what we saw on Monday when the IPCC released its latest report, which simply highlights what we have been hearing from indigenous communities for far too long. It is time for action. Protecting the land of indigenous peoples is closely linked to the key principles of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development of the United Nations, leaving no one behind and ensuring human rights for all. Particularly, we note that Objective 15 calls on countries to take urgent steps to reduce the loss of natural habitat and biodiversity, which are all part of our shared heritage. This is an agenda that inspired the week that we're celebrating here at the OAS today. This is why we call once again on governments to meet their obligations to recognize, respect, protect, and ensure the rights of indigenous peoples. We reiterate that steps must be taken to prevent, to address, and to punish acts of assault, violence, and harassment against indigenous leaders. The exclusion of indigenous peoples affects all of us as part of the human race. This is why there needs to be recognition and protection of the natural resources and territories of indigenous communities. In closing, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights highlights the holding of this special meeting of the OAS and recognizes its importance. We also appreciate the constant engagement with a number of government representatives in all of our work. This includes the ongoing monitoring of the state of indigenous peoples in our region. The ICHR reiterates its commitment to continue promoting, cooperating, and standing up for the rights of indigenous peoples, working closely with local organizations, civil society, and of course with the government represented in this honorable council. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner, for your presentation. Your report is very troubling, especially the reports of the violence and harassment and even killing of indigenous people. This, I'm sure, we in this permanent council agree, requires urgent and committed action from all of our states. Now, having heard the informative remarks shared by our guests, we will now proceed with comments and observations from delegations of member states, who I respectfully request to comply with the 5-minute maximum allowed under the rules of procedure of the Permanent Council. I now open the floor to delegations, and looking at my request list, the first request would be from Bolivia and from Ambassador Hector Arce. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair of the Permanent Council, Ambassador Sir Ronald Sanders of Antigua and Barbuda. It is a pleasure to greet you, as well as each and every one of the ambassadors and others present at this gathering. August 9th has been established as International Peoples' Day by the United Nations in 1994. That situation has been an act of justice for the millions of indigenous peoples across the globe. People who, unlike many of us, are not suffering from discrimination, individualism, and other forms of personal violence. In Bolivia, we have often said the following: the indigenous people are undoubtedly the moral reserve of humanity. We are the moral reserve because of our respect for Mother Earth, for the respect of complementarity and mutual respect that is so urgently needed across the globe. We stand as the moral reserve because we have been able to teach the world that we don't live in contrast to nature, but rather in concert with nature. Therefore, it is of the utmost importance of any organization, including the OAS, to devise policies that ensure the full exercise of indigenous peoples' rights, respect for their culture, their identity, and that the indigenous nations are recognized. In Bolivia, we have done so and sought to ensure the ongoing presence of all of our indigenous peoples in our national existence and recognize the work and the contributions of our indigenous peoples, as Antonio Rejola has just said. In Latin America, some 40 million people are indigenous in different countries that come from different peoples and nations throughout our Americas. Bolivia is the country that has the largest number of indigenous people, percentage-wise. Some 40% self-identify, according to the census data of 2012, as indigenous, and some 60% prior to that self-identified as being rural resident or indigenous. In 2009, therefore, we saw the first law that established Bolivia as a plurinational state, pursuant to Article 1 of the Constitution. This is not a minor event. It recognizes a cross-cutting change in our country, and one that ensures that our people, our indigenous people, are recognized as the core of the social fabric. In that regard, we believe that we stand as an example to other nations of how to incorporate fully indigenous peoples into the national system of governance. Let me conclude, Mr. Chair, by reminding the world of the history of Bolivia. Just like many other countries have seen over 180 years that our indigenous peoples have been relegated to a secondary status. In Bolivia, it changed thanks to our first indigenous President Evo Morales and the legislation that has led to Bolivia to be the country that it is today, a country that has taken its destiny into its own hands, a country that believes in itself and in its indigenous peoples. We hope that the power that we have achieved, the indigenous peoples govern Bolivia today and continue to govern, despite the discrimination that we've faced even here in the heart of the OAS and the most regrettable events of 2019 in the hands of the then Secretary General. We, on behalf of the plurinational state of Bolivia, our indigenous people, our president and our vice president, and those who represent us in our government, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador. As a point of interest, I do believe that the personal remarks that creep into statements that have no relevance to what we are talking about is unhelpful, and it would be a good thing if in this permanent council we try to desist from it when it is absolutely not necessary. Now I'd like to hand the floor, if I may, to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua, who's speaking from Nicaragua. Her name is Hermes Vanegas, and she's the president of the Regional Council of the North Caribbean area. I hope I've got that right. In any event, Madam, please, you have the floor.
Also Tratitania Niyavisna. Buenos días, ¿me escuchan?
Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes, ma'am. We can hear you but not see you. We continue to see a black screen indicates the technical side.
Yes, mi nombre es Emilce Vanegas, embajador.
Good morning. I am Melise Venegas. I would like to greet the chair of the Permanent Council and recognize also the representative of Uruguay. Secretary General Sir Ronald Sanders, ladies and gentlemen, representatives, both permanent and alternate of the member states, dear friends, representatives of the native peoples of our Americas, in this commemoration of International Peoples' Day, Nicaragua is proud to celebrate our ancestral indigenous traditions that inform and contribute to our national identity. We recognize our poets, legends, heroes, and artists that have brought forward our national culture. We recognize the constitutional precept that Nicaragua is a multi-ethnical and pluricultural nation. We recognize the past indigenous leaders from Maya, Mestizo, and other local cultures who never ceased to rebel against the imposition of Spanish rule, the anti-imperialist fight, the Sandinista Popular Revolution, and today the autonomy of the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean coast and the construction of a true Nicaraguan democracy in which all peoples and all social sectors are represented across our society. The reivindication of original peoples' rights can be seen in the implementation of programs that are so important, such as the Mother Earth Project, that has allowed for the demarcation and the establishment of property rights to Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples' territories through 2021. This includes 314 communities covering land that covers over 37,859.5 square kilometers with thousands of inhabitants and accounts for 31% of domestic territory. This is more than any other country in our hemisphere. Through the educational system, we ensure bilingual intercultural education in some 70% of elementary schools in indigenous communities, in which education is taught in their mother languages and has allowed for the level of illiteracy to drop by 57% in 2007 from 57% in 2007 to 8% in 2021. We have also strengthened our vocational technical education that is offered free of charge through the National Institute for Technology. The community and intercultural universities, as well as the online opportunities through the national educational system is also available. In the area of healthcare, the traditional uses of our indigenous peoples have been integrated into the family health and community model known as MOSAB, that ensures greater investments in infrastructure, professional training, and comprehensive organizations in the healthcare sector, providing for greater participation of all players, including our physicians, our traditional nurses, and our traditional healers, among other healthcare professionals. In the area of healthcare in indigenous areas, this has allowed for greater...
Ms. Venegas, you exceeded the 5-minute limitation, so may I please ask you to try to wrap it up as soon as you can. I apologize for doing this, but we do have a time constraint. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, gracias.
Very well, thank you.
Opportunity to say final words, so please do that.
De cara a la...
Facing the general celebration of November 7th upcoming, the original peoples will celebrate the election of the most diverse electoral council in Nicaragua, with the participation of indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants for November 7th, when we will have the national election. We will see the participation of many indigenous peoples who will be representing Nicaragua. These include men and women who will represent our original peoples. And we are also very proud that on the 24th and 25th of August, the verification was performed to allow 3 million people to be able to vote on November 7th. And we are very grateful for this opportunity because we are grateful to this government that has supported our indigenous peoples continuously. They've never abandoned us. They work hand in hand with the indigenous territorial governments, with our community governments. We also have the presence of regional authorities that are of indigenous peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rodriguez. And now with apologies to the representative of Brazil, I give you the floor, sir. I did unfortunately omit to call you before Nicaragua, and I knew you were in line. So please go ahead.
Por favor.
Thank you very much, Chair. I am indeed grateful for this opportunity. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, Sir Ronald, would like to thank the Permanent Council for offering us this opportunity to gather today. And I particularly would like to thank all of the speakers for their remarks, and particularly I would like to thank the Assistant Secretary General for the effort undertaken to celebrate this week. I would like to just show a very brief video with your indulgence. This has been prepared by the head of our Indigenous Peoples Foundation. Thank you very much, Chair.
A FUNAI, enquanto órgão indigenista oficial do governo brasileiro,
our organization is responsible for the protagonism in our country in this area. Brazil today has a number of different levels that account for 14% of our national government. We have some 270 groups that ensure the tremendous cultural wealth to protect our people during the pandemic. We have invested some 50 million reales in an effort to combat COVID-19. Let me note some 800,000 packages that have been provided to our indigenous peoples in terms of foodstuffs in an effort to ensure that food was available to them. This is over 1 million tons worth of foodstuff, in addition to expenditures that have been very substantive in terms of our efforts to ensure that we have been able to distribute this. We've also sought to provide protections to our indigenous peoples in very remote areas. We have also distributed a substantive number of kits for hygiene, supporting and overcoming and establishing over 300 barriers to seek to ensure no cross-contamination, banning travel between and among the different indigenous communities, again, in an effort to stem the tide of COVID-19 infections. We have also sought to ensure that our indigenous people have been in a position to improve their income and their living conditions despite the ongoing pandemic. We have sought to ensure sustainability, providing training opportunities in an unprecedented action by the federal government through the FUNAI. We have sought to ensure that people have been trained and a variety of different productive actions. The commitment of our foundation is with our local communities to ensure food security and productive development. We would like to reiterate our commitment to our indigenous economy. The new foundation, the new FUNAI that seeks to serve as a facilitator for the protagonism of our indigenous peoples themselves. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you very much. And now I am very pleased to give the floor to my good friend, the interim representative of the United States of America, Brad Fritton. Brad, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sanders, Mr. Chair. I would like to begin by thanking the Assistant Secretary General and his staff for all of their hard work in pulling together this event. We know it's never easy, and especially as we continue to combat a global pandemic. The United States is proud to join other delegations today in honoring the diverse indigenous groups throughout the Americas and seeking to address the historic and ongoing challenges they face. We thank the speakers for their expertise and thoughtful presentations. Mr. Chairman, the past year has been a difficult one during which the citizens throughout our hemisphere have faced new and intensified challenges. However, we are deeply conscious of the unique intersectional challenges that indigenous communities have faced during the pandemic and how this has exacerbated persisting problems. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to advancing the protection, support, and prosperity of tribal nations throughout the Americas. Specifically, the United States is proud to be partnering globally with governments, NGOs, and civil society to work to ensure that indigenous peoples and all marginalized groups have access to vaccines, testing, and treatment as we continue to deal with the effects of COVID-19, especially within the Americas. Domestically, the United States government is closely coordinating with U.S. indigenous communities in our COVID-19 response efforts to address the needs of Native American and Alaskan tribal groups. To aid this goal, in July, the Biden administration gave $100 million of COVID-19 rescue funds specifically to American indigenous communities. Mr. Chairman, we are also cognizant of the intersectional impacts of the COVID-19 global pandemic. COVID-19 is impacting every nation. It is imperative that during such times, governments take active measures to protect all members of the community, especially vulnerable populations and members of at-risk ethnic, racial, or religious groups. Chair, my delegation is also well aware of the non-COVID related challenges facing our indigenous communities. Combating racism and discrimination is something that the Biden-Harris administration is committed to address. These are issues that every OAS member state, including the United States, faces to a greater or lesser extent. And it is a challenge we must all work together to overcome. Eliminating discrimination and inequality is not only the morally correct thing to do, it is necessary for sustainable economic growth, prosperity, and environmental protection throughout the region. Economic opportunity must be inclusive, enhancing opportunities for all people while building respect, trust, and understanding across race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity. We are pleased that the OAS moved forward with this week of recognition and awareness raising, despite all the challenges we face from the global pandemic, to recognize the achievements of indigenous peoples and acknowledge the challenges they face. I assure you that it is a priority of the Biden-Harris administration to respect tribal sovereignty and self-governance, particularly at this point in time where our indigenous communities have been disproportionately affected by crises in our country related to health, the economy, racial justice, climate change, and the COVID-19 pandemic. In order to adhere to his commitments, President Biden is ensuring the completion of a report by all agencies in the United States government on the actions they will take to implement the President's Executive Order 13175 related to the rights of indigenous peoples. This order establishes a mandate where all governmental departments and agencies must engage in regular, meaningful, and robust consultation with tribal officials in the development of federal policies that have tribal equities. President Biden is also reintroducing regular meetings of the White House Council on Native American Affairs, which has not met consistently since 2016. We hope that this consistent dialogue will reinforce the administration's support for tribal sovereignty and self-governance and will help to fulfill the Federal Trust Treaty responsibilities to tribal nations. I would like to finish by stating that as we begin to emerge from the pandemic, it is more important than ever that all member states of the OAS do all they can to protect the sovereignty and rights of their indigenous communities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Brad Frieden. And now I give the floor to our distinguished ambassador from Canada, who has the capacity, I know, to deliver a message in 2 languages in less than 5 minutes. Ambassador Adsett, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sir Ronald. I will do my best this morning. It's a pleasure to see you and the Secretary General. And I wanted actually to start with 2 words of thanks. One, to thank Nestor Mendez and his group, of course, for the hard work in preparing this, but also to thank Her Excellency Froila Salem, Governor General of Belize, for her presence with us this morning as well. Colleagues, it's an important day for us this morning because it's an opportunity for us to come together to celebrate the vibrant and diverse cultures, languages, and traditions of Indigenous peoples in the Americas and around the world. And before I make a few comments, I think it's important for us to recognize in this virtual format that we're joining from different locations, some of which may be traditional Indigenous territory. And I think it's right for us to take a moment to reflect on that and acknowledge that as well. It's not only an opportunity for us to celebrate the contributions of Indigenous peoples, but also to acknowledge the systemic racism, discrimination, and unacceptable injustices that Indigenous peoples continue to face. This year's theme allows us to take a hard look at our existing systems and to take meaningful steps through engagement and partnership with Indigenous peoples to end these injustices and to address ongoing challenges, many of which have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and many spoke to this already. We may not like what we see when we take a hard look. In Canada, we continue to learn about the impacts of colonialism. Recently, hundreds of unmarked graves were located near former residential schools in British Columbia and Saskatchewan. What happened at residential schools is neither an exception nor an isolated incident. For over 100 years, until the last federally operated school was closed in 1996, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families and communities and sent to residential schools across Canada, where many suffered mistreatment, physical, and sexual abuse. This is the fault of Canada. Our country failed the hundreds of children buried at these sites and the many more survivors of former residential schools. We must acknowledge this truth, learn from our past, and walk the shared path of reconciliation. I will continue in French.
And so Canada has embarked on a journey of reconciliation. Between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, pursuing the goal of advancing reconciliation in Canada in everything we do. For example, Canada took an important step by incorporating the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into Canadian law in June this year. Also in June, a national action plan on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people developed with Indigenous partners was released. The plan includes a federal pathway component and is a major step toward ending violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people. Another example is a recognition of rights discussion tables, bringing together the Government of Canada and more than 390 Indigenous communities to explore new ways to advance Indigenous rights and self-determination. And
I want to mention how proud we are that on July 26th, Her Excellency the Right Honorable Mary Simon was installed as the 30th Governor General and Commander-in-Chief. She's the first Indigenous person to hold the position in Canada and joins Her Excellency Froila Zalem of Belize as the second Indigenous Governor General in the Americas. Throughout her distinguished career, Her Excellency has attained national and international recognition for her work on Arctic and Indigenous issues and as an advocate for Inuit rights and culture. In closing, Mr. Chair, we mustn't forget, as has been mentioned by several speakers, the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly on Indigenous communities. In Canada, Indigenous communities were quick to organize and successfully respond to the needs of those communities. We will continue to support these efforts and efforts by Indigenous leaders to enhance Indigenous economic development at the international level, both bilateral and multilateral. And let me thank the Canadian participant on the panel this morning, Mr. Wayne Garnos-Williams, for referring to that. In closing, to quote Prime Minister Trudeau, by working together, we can build a new social contract that recognizes Indigenous peoples' inherent right to self-determination and self-government, advances social and economic equality, and protects Indigenous laws, lands, cultures, and languages. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I passed the time by 15 seconds. Thank you.
I noticed that, but forgiven. Now, I'd like to offer the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Kitts Nevis, Ambassador Everson Hull, who will speak this morning on behalf of the CARICOM Group.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I take the floor on behalf of the CARICOM Group as the designee of the coordinator of our CARICOM Group of ambassadors, who, as is obvious to all, is otherwise occupied this morning chairing this Permanent Council meeting. Distinguished colleagues, CARICOM governments are acutely aware that as part of the colonial legacy, they inherited circumstances in which the great vast acts of genocide were perpetrated on the indigenous peoples by the European powers of the time. A community which in the year 1700 of over 3 million persons in the West Indian Islands was consistently reduced by genocide and imported disease to less than 30,000 by the time these islands became independent. In 2013, CARICOM heads of government established the CARICOM Reparations Commission. The commission has the mandate to prepare the case for reparatory justice for the region's indigenous people and African descendants whose ancestors were the victims of genocide, slavery, slave trading, and racial apartheid. The commission asserts that victims and descendants of these crimes have a legal right to reparatory justice, and that those who committed these crimes and who have been enriched by the proceeds of these crimes have a reparatory case to answer. Over the last 8 years, CARICOM leaders and heads of our institutions of learning have raised this matter in many international organizations, including as a special item on a regular meeting of this Permanent Council in 2016. There has been some success, especially from the universities in Europe, which were built on the blood and forced labor of indigenous people and enslaved Africans. As yet, however, no apology has been made for these atrocities in the Caribbean. Such statements as have been made do not acknowledge that crimes have been committed. These statements, expressing only regret, represent a reprehensible response to the call for apology, in that they suggest that victims and their descendants are not worthy of an apology. Mr. Chair, within CARICOM, where sizable indigenous populations remain in some of our countries, the governments have implemented measures to provide them land title, local autonomy, and equal participation and opportunities in all aspects of national life. Beyond what we are doing within our own shores, the CARICOM Commission has formulated a 10-point plan to address reparatory justice. The Commission has asserted that the governments of Europe committed genocide upon the indigenous people of our region. Military commanders were given official instructions by their governments to eliminate those communities and to remove those who survive programs. We also now know that sadly, in the not too distant past, governments in our inter-American system also authorized certain atrocities against indigenous people, including children. Mr. Chairman, genocide and land appropriation went hand in hand, accounting for the landlessness and impoverishment of indigenous peoples in our hemisphere. Survivors remain the most marginalized social group within the Americas today. CARICOM countries remain committed to the cause of reparatory justice for indigenous people and African descendants, and are continuing to argue the case vigorously in every international forum, and particularly in the capitals of nations that profited from these evils. We firmly believe that we must move from ritual statements to delivery of justice for wrongs which are evident in the records and to which history is witness. In this connection, we say in this Permanent Council that any new social contract in the Americas for indigenous people cannot ignore reparatory justice and must form an integral part of the terms. The indigenous peoples of our hemisphere, ladies and gentlemen, deserve no less. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hull. A very important statement and made within the 5-minute period. So thank you very much for that too. And now I would like to give the floor to my very good friend, Ambassador Baños Rivas of Mexico. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Like we do every year, Mexico is an active participant in the Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples, which now carries a slogan that is linked to the health crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare and compounded our inequality and disproportionately affected peoples throughout the world who are already vulnerable and suffering from poverty, discrimination, exclusion, and disease. However, all of this has been catalyzed in the case of indigenous peoples. The Mexican government is aware of the need for a new social contract. Starting December 2018, under the law from the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples, there is recognition of indigenous and Black Mexican communities as subject to public law and rights, and the need for renewal and turnover of seats with representation of the state and its peoples. There will be preference given to those who are most low income and who have been forgotten, particularly to indigenous communities in Mexico, as stated by the President of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, while also taking on the commitment of promoting and implementing the rights of these communities in line with international laws on this, such as Convention 169 of the ILO, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In that regard, by requiring a meaningful transformation of the current political, legal, and economic conditions that govern the organization of how Mexico carries out business and its relationship with indigenous communities and Black communities, this can only come from a comprehensive reform of the Constitution and the laws related, as expressed by Gabriel Mendez Lopez, the indigenous leader, said in his remarks. To strengthen this constitutional amendment, the government of Mexico in 2019 held 54 regional forums to consult with these communities, one of which focused on Black Mexican communities, and another was held in Los Angeles, California, with indigenous migrants, as well as a national forum that was held in Mexico City. In 2020, because of the pandemic, this initiative was unable to continue going forward. However, other steps have been taken. There's been, for example, a follow-up and monitoring of the accords and agreements relating to free, prior, and informed consent for the implementation and promotion of constitutional reform. June of this year, there were consultations held with members of the follow-up commission named by the regional forums, the liaison committee members, as well as community and traditional indigenous authorities and Afro-Mexican authorities, where the proposed initiative for constitutional amendment was presented. Starting in July and August 2021, the signature process for endorsement for this initiative to reform the Constitution has been held in Afro-Mexican and indigenous communities, which will be submitted to the executive this month and throughout September. This will be presented before the Congress, and the following legislature process will ensue. In October 2020, the President published executive order to create the Presidential Committee on Justice for the Yaqui community in Sonora. The goal is to review, design, and propose a justice plan for this community in consultation with traditional authorities within the community by formulating the strategies and actions for consent led by technical and local authorities. The goal is to pay back the historical debt the government has with that people. In May 2021, the President of Mexico also held a ceremony to ask publicly for forgiveness given abuses of the Mayan people during the commemoration of the Castas or Caste War. This helps to bring back the historical memory of what happened to indigenous peoples and to recognize these communities as communities of ancestral history. Mr. Chairman, the Mexican government recognizes indigenous peoples and communities as subject to national law and in charge of their own development and future. My delegation highlights that on behalf of Bolivia, Guatemala, Panama, Paraguay, and Peru, we had the honor of submitting the proposed paragraphs on the section follow-up to the implementation of ADRIP and the action plan for ADRIP 2017-2021 for the upcoming General Assembly. In this proposal, there is a recommendation to extend the action plan on the American Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, which is to conclude this year, 2021, for a longer period in order to provide due follow-up and implementation, given the roadblocks that have come up because of the pandemic. Mexico and the countries I mentioned all appreciate all support that can come from members. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Valdez Rivas. Now, I just want to quickly remind that we've got another permanent council meeting this afternoon. It's important that we try to get this one finished on time, notwithstanding the importance of the subject with which we are dealing and to which we are giving all due and proper attention. But I would request that people try to keep within the 5-minute limit of the of speaking. Now I give the floor to the Ambassador of Belize, Ambassador Raymond Lin Young. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I want to say that on behalf of the government and the people of Belize, I want to sincerely thank the OAS for the opportunity afforded to our Governor General, the first Indigenous female Governor General in the British Commonwealth, to address our meeting today. It is an honor and a recognition that we deeply appreciate. I also thank the other speakers for their well-received contributions, and I especially want to thank Ambassador Hull for that strong statement from CARICOM, which Belize is very happy to be associated with. Belize has long been a leader in respecting the rights of indigenous people in the Americas. The preamble of Belize's constitution states inter alia that the people of Belize require policies of state which, among other things, protect the identity, dignity, and the social and cultural values of Belizeans, including Belize's indigenous peoples. This is strongly represented in our population and in our House of Representatives, which, although very diverse, features a strong representation of indigenous people and their descendants. And of course, our head of state, who you heard from today. So, in Belize, the identity and social and cultural values of our indigenous people are firmly woven into our way of life. We very strongly support the recognition of the plight of indigenous peoples throughout the hemisphere during this week devoted to indigenous people. The situation clearly calls for a new social contract in the Americas, and like most countries in the Americas, we feel that our prosperity much depends on positive change. So again, keep it short and within 5 minutes. Many thanks for the opportunity to focus the spotlight on this very important challenge. And we look forward to participating in the international effort to make a difference. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you very much too for keeping your remarks as brief but as pertinent as you have done. And now I give the floor to the Ambassador of Costa Rica. You have the floor.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Your Excellency, Governor General of Belize, Froila Talam, Luis Almagro, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, distinguished panelists, ambassadors, delegates. Our delegation appreciates this special meeting of the Permanent Council to commemorate the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples as part of the 4th Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples, calling for a new social contract in the Americas that leaves no one behind. Our country recognizes that defending the rights of indigenous peoples is a wide-ranging action that is important in foreign policy as well as in national policy in order to pay a debt that is owed, recognizing the spiritual and material components in the identity of our indigenous peoples are part of their relationship with Mother Earth. It's essential for the cultural survival and community integration, and it is also part and parcel of our national identity. In 2015, with the reform of the Constitution, not only was Costa Rica seen as a multi-ethnic and multicultural government, but it also allowed for inclusion of indigenous communities and their different values and identities. It also recognized the importance of the ethnic legacy and contribution to the Republic. This reform was to pay back a historical debt with indigenous peoples and with other groups that are active members of our national body. Since then, there's been public policy design in line with international standards in order to go beyond just policy making, to create the necessary comprehensive instruments so that the integration and implementation of these principles could be experienced, and also understanding that all of this needs to be done within the law of the country and in line with the worldview and customs of indigenous peoples. As part of these steps, there is a very carefully designed dialogue and consultation process to address the demands of indigenous peoples, which led to the implementation and design of the national policy for a society free of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia. As part of the government policy that recognized historical racism and the lack of protection of these communities. This national community was one of the voluntary commitments undertaken by Costa Rica during the 3rd Global Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, in response to the first Universal Periodic Review, in which it highlighted the need to strengthen the legal framework and institutional framework in Costa Rica in order to end racism and discrimination. Thanks to this policy, we were able to reiterate our full commitment to protect and advance the rights of these communities. In 2018, Costa Rica created the General Mechanism for Consultation with Indigenous Peoples. This was the first of its kind in Latin America to be designed under the standard for consulting in consultation. Following recommendations of the Special Rapporteurship on Indigenous Peoples of the United Nations. This is established as the guide to follow and highlights the need to consult with these communities when some project or policy may affect these communities, establishing, therefore, the required commitment and agreement with these communities in order to move forward, and also in line with Convention 169 of the ILO. This is where, along with the participatory construction and building of these policies with indigenous peoples has taken place, through which we look for full implementation of these communities in adopting decisions that may be linked to the adoption and implementation of laws, public policy programs, and steps taken that could have an impact on these communities. In 2020, as part of the steps taken, the National Plan for the Recovery of Indigenous Communities' Territory was also established, and land titles were handed out for ancestral land to indigenous communities. Over the last year, given the COVID-19 pandemic, the government has been working comprehensively with health officials and civil society, NGOs, and the UN system to prioritize work done for indigenous territories and to address the emergency not only with measures that are consistent with its traditions, but also by providing educational material and audiovisual material in target languages in order to ensure that all communities can follow in their language. Costa Rica takes this opportunity to once again reiterate our commitment to continue protecting and ensuring the rights of indigenous peoples and advocates for the inclusion of an indigenous perspective that can ensure there is visibility and respect for its culture and multi-thousand-year-old history and cultures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And now I give the floor to the distinguished Ambassador of Paraguay.
Very good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Allow me to first commend and appreciate on behalf of my country all of the presentations and contributions on such an important day for all of us. We have seen increased highlighting of the importance and recognition of our indigenous peoples in societies in the region and throughout the world. For Paraguay, respecting and protecting human rights is an essential component of its foreign policy. Paraguay recognizes the authority of different bodies in treaties and works with these same players, and we have also acted with international standards for human rights protection, for which we have adopted the key international instruments to protect these rights, both regionally as well as universally. This is a historic decision for indigenous peoples in Paraguay, and I'm referring to the Decree 1039/2019 from the Executive on the Protocol on Consultation and Consent, this being the FPIC, Free, Prior, and Informed Consent with indigenous communities in Paraguay. The goal is to implement the laws, conventions, and international treaties, and to ensure that there is engagement with indigenous communities on any projects taken on by private or public sector companies that could impact their right to life, to land, to the enjoyment of traditional values, among other fundamental rights. Similarly, in order to ensure the effective exercise of civil and political rights for indigenous communities, the Paraguay Institute for Indigenous Peoples, which is the central body on this issue, and the electoral justice body entered into an international convention through which both agencies will promote the voting rights of indigenous communities, committing to carrying out training and education workshops on the rights and other matters pertaining to voting rights for these communities. In April, the national plan was submitted for designing and implementing public policy and national policies that are in line with the way of life of indigenous communities. This plan shows the thinking of indigenous peoples, indigenous leaders, women, young people, and the older population who, thanks to technological, and support from NGOs and from indigenous organizations, have all been able to create a strategic action agenda to ensure these rights. This was through a process that was supported by intercultural dialogue. Also, as seen in the commitment of the government of Paraguay, there has been major progress done in complying with the sentences of the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, as we saw in the friendly settlement agreements in terms of land assurances and the creation of committees to implement development funds created to address these needs. We recognize that we are going through tough times because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But this actually pulls back the veil on the inequality experienced by vulnerable groups, which is why Paraguay reiterates its commitment to continue to formulate public policies based on the human rights of indigenous peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that very important statement. And now we'll give the floor to Gustavo Tari.
Thank you very much. We thank and take note of all presentations delivered by the distinguished panelists, as well as of the statements from the permanent representatives. Since January 2016, we have been speaking out against a dictatorship in Venezuela which denies indigenous peoples their human and political rights. We have also stated that the Maduro regime has allowed and facilitated exploitation in ancestral lands of Aboriginal and Native peoples. This has not only been part of ecocide, but also affected what is the heritage of humanity in these lands that are systematically looted. That has come with diseases and massacres and a plight of indigenous peoples. When it comes to vaccination, we reiterate what we have said several times when it comes to people in Venezuela. There are no vaccines for indigenous peoples or for Venezuelans as part of a vaccine plan or some guarantee to equal access to this preventive measure. In March 2020, a number of NGOs in Venezuela have recorded 18 mass killings in communities in Venezuela. Over 2 years ago, our mission at this permanent council spoke out about the Bacarau massacre in Mena Sabana municipality, where 8 indigenous peoples were murdered. In February 2019, the National Armed Forces of Venezuela opened fire on the Cumarayacapa community on the border with Brazil, leaving 18 people injured and 3 dead. The next day, the National Guard indiscriminately opened fire against demonstrators in Santanera de Gurre at a local hospital, leaving 7 people dead, 4 of which were indigenous, 26 people shot and 16 people detained. These incidents from February 2019 led to the displacement of over 1,000 people to Brazil who were taken in by the authorities in Brazil. The High Commissioner for Human Rights called this irreparable damage of peoples who have suffered from consistent violation of their rights, affecting their land and their their right to self-determination. We need to continue to condemn these arbitrary detentions and abuse against Venezuelan indigenous leaders, which was the case for Salvador Franco, who was from the Cremona area and recently died in detention without getting any medical treatment given his delicate medical condition. Today, as we commemorate the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, we call on all countries who claim to be friends of indigenous peoples to learn about the state of affairs for indigenous peoples in Venezuela and to take action accordingly. Thank you.
The chair does not appreciate the fact that partisan attacks are made on governments without the right of reply. That is all the chair will say in response to this matter. And now we will proceed to the next speaker, who on my list is the representative of Suriname. You have the floor. Suriname, you have the floor.
Good. Hello, can I be
You have
heard?
the floor. Yes, you can. Please proceed.
The government of the Republic of Suriname expresses its appreciation to the Permanent Council for convening this special meeting on the commemoration of the Inter-American Week for Indigenous People, and this year's theme, Leaving No One Behind, Indigenous People and the Call for a New Social Contract in the Americas. We also express our appreciation to the speakers for their remarks. The delegation of Suriname associates itself with a statement just delivered by Ambassador Hall on behalf of CARICOM. Suriname is one of the most ethnically diverse nations in the Western Hemisphere, with consequentially different dynamics, especially in terms of its social environment. Ethnic, culture, and religious diversity has been exemplary for Suriname. We can peacefully commemorate two activities of different ethnic groups on one day. On August 9, we commemorate two important events, namely Japanese immigration and Indigenous Peoples Day. The first Japanese immigrants arrived in Suriname on August 9, 1819, and enriched our culture in different ways, as well as contributed to the development of the country. Following the United Nations proclamation in 1994 of the Indigenous Day of Indigenous People, the government of Suriname recognized August 9 as a national holiday since 2006. The population of the Republic of Suriname consists of 25.46% of indigenous and tribal people living in the hinterlands and the coastal areas. The tribal communities are further divided in indigenous people, which is approximately 3.6% of the population, and Maroons, which is approximately 21.7%. The indigenous tribes that live in Suriname and still speak their own language are the Kalinyas, or Karinya or Carib, the Lokono or Arawak, Trio, and the associate peoples, and the Wayanas. President Santokhi, in his national address to the country, mentioned the following, quote, "International Day of Indigenous People is an important recognition of the existence for all indigenous people of the world. In recent decades, the world has made significant strides in championing the rights of indigenous people. However, more needs to be done for the indigenous peoples. The indigenous peoples, as the first inhabitants of our country, also want development and improvement based on national and international recognized rights. As president, I want, along with the government and parliament, to empower the indigenous community to thrive in health and ensure their well-being. Let us strive for the fulfillment of the economic, social, and cultural rights of indigenous peoples, as well as the essential right to fundamental dignity. Let's make sure that our indigenous brothers and sisters do not lag behind in pursuing sustainable development goals. Indigenous people have ancient wisdom to live in harmony with nature, unquote. The government of Suriname believes that it is of great importance that we as a society recognize that indigenous and tribal people, because of the nature of their habitat, living habits, and culture, have individual and collective rights as enshrined in the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights. Equally important is to ensure the social cohesion of the society, peace and stability, and sustainable development of our country. Based on the aforementioned, the President of the Republic of Suriname presented the draft law on collective rights of indigenous people and tribal people to the Parliament on June 15 this year for further discussion and approval. Suriname continues to be committed to the advancement and further development of its indigenous people and tribal communities. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, representative of Suriname. And now I give the floor to the most distinguished representative of Guyana, Ambassador Samuel Hines. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, for giving me the floor. Your Excellency, Governor General of Belize, Mr. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, distinguished permanent representatives and alternate representatives. Having presented my credentials last week, I'm delighted to join in participating in this, my first meeting, which celebrates the invaluable contributions made by indigenous peoples in the hemispheres. This will include Guyana's own indigenous peoples, which constitute about 10% of our total population of about 800,000. Indigenous people form the third largest ethnic group in Guyana and are the fastest growing group. Mr. Chair, I would like to associate Guyana with the statement made on behalf of the CARICOM group. Permit me to reiterate that the government of Guyana is working tirelessly to ensure that all Guyanese share in and benefit from our economic growth in line with our program for inclusive and equitable development of all our people. In this respect, the theme chosen for this Indigenous Week is apt: leaving no one behind, indigenous peoples and the call for a new social contract in the Americas. Key to achieving this objective is equal participation in the decision-making process. The continued call for inclusion and meaningful engagement by indigenous peoples is being made against the backdrop of the COVID-19 global pandemic, which adversely impacts the lives and livelihoods of all our citizens, especially the vulnerable populations. Hence, in the 2021 national budget, the government of Guyana outlined its response to fighting the pandemic through the COVID-19 response program, which expanded on critical items needed to roll out COVID-19 vaccines in Guyana. The government also budgeted US $13 million for the modernization and expansion of public hospitals in all areas, including those in our hinterland, which serve predominantly indigenous peoples, such as the Paramakatoy, Keto, Kumaka District, and Aishalton hospitals. Mr. Chair, The government of Guyana attaches significant importance to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG number 4, quality education, and strives to ensure that Amerindian students benefit from universal primary education. Efforts are ongoing to increase access to secondary and university opportunities. In the 2020 academic year, the number of awards of national scholarships to Amerindian students pursuing university education was the largest ever. The government of Guyana is unwavering in its belief that investment in education always pays dividends. Mr. Chair, indigenous Amerindian people in Guyana are rapidly taking their place alongside other ethnic groups. Mrs. Carlin Rodriguez Burkett, an indigenous woman, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and currently Guyana's permanent representative to the United Nations, is a prime example of this trend. She is the first woman to hold those posts and serves as a role model for all Guyanese women and girls. On April 23rd, at the 20th session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, our Minister of Amerindian Affairs, the Honorable Pauline Sukai, also an indigenous woman, reiterated that our government supports Amerindians people's right to land. The Honorable Minister mentioned that Amerindian villages currently own an estimated 14% of Guyana's land area, and this is intended to be substantially increased to an estimated 20% at the end of the Amerindian land titling project, to which US $6.3 million is allocated in our national budget of 2021. Mr. Chair, whilst about 2/3 of our indigenous peoples live in their old ancestral villages and new villages, about 1/3 live and work throughout Guyana, alongside all other ethnicities. And I would say there they enjoy all the rights of citizens, owning land and properties. In a similar way, in the villages, the villagers have been welcoming Guyanese of all other ethnicities. We in Guyana are well on the road towards attaining our aspiration of becoming one people, one nation with one destiny. Mr. Chair, in concluding, the government of Guyana is fully cognizant that more needs to be done to improve the lives and livelihoods of our people, including our indigenous brothers and sisters. In this regard, the government is firmly committed to remaining engaged with indigenous community leaders and all stakeholders to ensure that the aspirations of all Guyanese to benefit from equal opportunities to shape and chart Guyana's bright future are realized. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hines. And now I give the floor to the distinguished ambassador of Colombia, Ambassador Ordonez. Ambassador, you have the floor, sir. Ambassador, here he is. Please proceed, sir.
Yeah, wait.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I bring the greetings to the distinguished presenters at this special session to celebrate the 4th annual Week of Indigenous Peoples. Colombia would like to take advantage of this opportunity to recognize the contribution of our indigenous peoples to our culture and to the form of life in Colombia. This is important within the context of unity in our country. One important form of protection for our indigenous peoples is the legal institution of safeguards that have been instituted nationally, but it is something that also goes back to preceding eras, back to the pre-colonial era, which recognized the indigenous communities with their legal entity, giving them collective land titles so that they can enjoy private property and also ensure collective rights that is embargoable as well as permanent. These territories have formed 5 territories of the national organizations throughout the country, including one based in the Amazon, one in Tayrona, as well as the broader sector. There are also institutional opportunities for participation of indigenous peoples, where decisions are made jointly in the area of development, and the 2018-2022 development plan provides for differentiated development for our groups, particularly targeting a reduction in the gap between indigenous peoples and others. We have an accent on our agreements in the areas focused on women, family, generation, territory, land, cultural integrity, harmony, and balance for the defense of life, as well as a pact on behalf of the regions. The priority then is to work hand in hand with indigenous authorities to identify means to develop a set of plans, programs, and projects with a view toward environmental preservation and conservation. In Colombia, we have a policy of ethno-education, which is understood as a collective process in which groups strengthen their autonomy through interculturality. In the area of healthcare, we have ensured coverage of 97% of ethnic communities, which is above the national average. In coordination with local authorities and indigenous peoples, the central government is seeking to move forward in our own intercultural indigenous peoples health plan. We have invested $2.5 million in developing a health model for indigenous peoples. To promote the development of our vulnerable communities, we've also promoted a project known as Hidraca, which seeks to generate additional revenue, food security, regional territorial management, and economic sustenance with an investment of over $17 million. The national project for cultivation substitution to replace illegal crops seeks to ensure voluntary substitution through development. In this regard, we have seen the participation of over 5,000 individuals who belong to in these community lands known as resguardos or safeguarded territories, and we have worked to ensure that these specific cultural and eco-protection systems of a traditional nature are being respected, particularly with a view toward reducing the risk of climate change and to mitigate its impact. Mr. Chair, this is just a few examples of the effort that Colombia is undertaking to ensure a balanced society. The call for a social compact and leaving no one behind certainly is of importance, but it is also important to ensure that the path towards inclusion does not offset the progress that has already been made in ensuring respect. engaging in actions that have been of a violent nature against statues and other legendary figures, many of whom were of indigenous extraction, serves no practical purpose and does no good. We must continue to work together and work forward to a better future for all. Thank you, Chair.
Ambassador Ordonez. So now I give the floor to the Ambassador of Argentina, Carlos Raimundi. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me first recognize the celebration of this Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples. And let me note briefly that the government of Argentina has a three-tiered approach, and the most profound of these is the constitutional recognition of the ethnic and cultural existence of indigenous peoples, the right to identity, and to the land upon which they live. The second level is one of the legislative level that ensures bilingual education, indigenous-owned communications media, as well as the composition of the National Institute for Indigenous Peoples, which is led by representatives of the different indigenous communities of Argentina. Among these three tiers, perhaps the most important is the cultural framework in which all of these discussions take place. We here at the OAS are celebrating for the fourth occasion a week of something that has been in existence for 500 years. This recognition has come quite late, and therefore it is pressing and urgent for us to catch up. We have lagged very far behind as states in the Americas in the acknowledgement and recognition of these rights. Now, it has been a positive change. Things like plurinationality, multiculturality has now come to the forefront, and that is a good thing. The recognition of our indigenous peoples, their cultures and cosmovisions is important to our states, but it's also important because of the existential approach and tack taken, the meaning of life, the meaning of death, the respect for our ancestors, the relationship with nature, Mother Earth, the understanding of property. There's a new construction of knowledge emanating from this, a new logic in the organization of our knowledge. And the impact has been so great that we have seen to the election of indigenous presidents in our region. And that is why I believe it is so important that this organization begin to think about and to find the best paths to incorporating the languages as well that will enable us to understand, interpret, and comprehend the deepest thinking and processes of our indigenous peoples, to incorporate languages as well as part of the form of communication within this organization. In other words, we've moved from a period of tolerance to one of assimilation to giving concessions. And that is not the point. On the contrary, we need to ensure that we are now recognizing unalienable rights, cultures that are not one stacked above another, but that are an equal standing, in equal stead. It's not a question of giving concessions, but recognizing the inalienable rights of millions of our brothers and sisters and our fellow citizens across the Americas. That is what should be inspiring the institutions that we seek to modernize through this session and others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I offer the floor to the distinguished representative of the Holy See. You have the floor.
Chair, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, the Holy See tracks closely the reality of indigenous peoples in an effort to ensure respect for their rights. The Pope has issued a statement with regard to the people of the Amazon, and he has noted that these people especially establish a good living and a good life. This involves the family, the community, and the cosmovision, and that is expressed in the community understanding of existence, in the ability to find joy through a simple, austere lifestyle, as well as reasonable care for nature, to preserve the resources as well for future generations. These peoples have much to teach us. End quote. For the Holy See, it is of the utmost importance to work for indigenous peoples, to invest in a broader understanding of these cultures so that they may lead their own process of cultural change. The effort made by ecclesiastical bodies such as episcopal conferences and our other local network, as well as that present in the Amazon, are carrying out projects and undertakings to protect the dignity of the indigenous peoples and to protect access to justice by indigenous peoples. Also, with regard to the sad and regrettable actions of the past, we must continue to move forward, recognizing the rights and cultural values of our brothers and sisters of indigenous origin. The Amazonian Basin Network, RETAM, has a technical team that works hand in hand with academics in the Amazon Basin, the United States, and Europe to seek to ensure the violations of indigenous peoples' rights is also made known. There is an effort made to systematize these violations to ensure that cases are reported within the inter-American human rights system and others. As a result, there have been a number of hearings before the Inter-American Human Rights Commission that have stemmed from violations in the Amazon Basin and the reports that have been made to the corresponding groups within the Inter-American system. The Holy See would also like to call your attention to the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. As the Pope has said, everyone should have access to the vaccine. And in this context, we have sought through our network to ensure vaccination of indigenous peoples in the Amazon basins, given the high level of contagion and deaths in the sector of society. We believe that the lack of sufficient vaccines and disinformation in many places has been detrimental to effort. Therefore, we call upon national governments and all those who have access to continue to acquire vaccines and to strive to ensure that indigenous peoples are vaccinated as expediently as possible. The Holy See, Mr. Chair, is seeking to improve living conditions for these people. And as the Pope has said, while we continue to struggle and fight for them and with them, we are also called upon to be their friends, to listen to them, to interpret them, and to incorporate the mysterious wisdom that God seeks to provide to us all through them. Thank you very much, Chair. From the interpreters, we've done our best. Sounded origin was very much wanting.
Thank you very much. Monsignor, thank you very much for your presentation. Now I give the final word to our collective friend, the distinguished ambassador of Spain, who no doubt will keep us within as close confines to the end of this meeting as possible. Ambassador, great to see you, and you have the floor.
Hola. Hello and good morning and good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General. A special greeting to everyone who has been part of the panel and attended this special meeting of the Permanent Council. From the Permanent Observer Mission of Spain, we would like to enthusiastically echo those who have hailed the commemoration of this International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples and the 4th Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples. We applaud this event. I take the floor in order to state our position for the full and effective political participation of indigenous peoples, as well as the defense of these communities' rights to their way of life and to self-government, to defending ancestral lands, their heritage, and their rich cultural diversity. I'd also like to state our position in favor of the challenges and shared commitments to defending biodiversity and protecting the environment, as well as equal access to COVID-19 vaccines. What we've seen in reality is that over 6% of the global population is indigenous, and however, they account for about 15% of those living in extreme poverty, according to the World Bank. Something that we can't nor want to continue to ignore. Spanish cooperation works to stand up for the rights of indigenous peoples through the Indigenous ACI program, which is a joint effort from the cooperation agency in Spain and indigenous communities in order to continue to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is where over 60 million indigenous peoples live in about 20 countries. The Indigenous program prioritizes the fight for the rights of indigenous women who have historically been discriminated against. It supports the fight against all kinds of gender and sexual, political, and other types of violence, and promotes the empowerment, and this being the economic empowerment of indigenous women by providing them with tools and increasing their clout in society. In addition to giving priority to political engagement of indigenous individuals and as groups, we highlight the importance of an opportunity for all. This is work that is being done by the agency in Spain for over 25 years that we reiterate today. Leaving no one behind, indigenous peoples, and the call for a new social contract is the slogan provided by the UN and adopted by the OAS for 2021. From Spain, we join this and highlight the need for respect for diversity and equality and gender equality, as well as political participation. Lastly, we would like to applaud Lama for the tireless work conducted this week. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And with that, we've concluded this special and very important meeting, focusing on the indigenous peoples of our hemisphere and the urgent need for a new social contract that corrects inequities and sets a new and progressive path of inclusion and development. I thank all of you who have participated so fully in this meeting. The presentations and comments made today will be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. Thank you all very much. The meeting is now adjourned. Adjourned.